There are few aircraft in history more iconic, more influential, and more secretive than Lockheed's F-117 Nighthawk. An aircraft so mysterious it entered service 6 years before the US government even acknowledged that it existed. A jet that was flying combat operations over Panama before the public even got its first good look at it. And today, some 16 years since the Nighthawk's official retirement, F-117s are still spotted in the sky all the time, standing in during air combat exercises for the most advanced adversary aircraft in the world, and even as low observable cruise missiles, because despite being more than 4 decades old, the F-117 is still harder to detect than any aircraft fielded by Russia or China. But even with all we've come to learn about this legendary black jet over the years, it seems the Nighthawk may still be keeping some secrets. So let's see if we can't uncover some. Because I want to talk about the rumors that the F-117 Nighthawk was pulled out of retirement and sent back into operational service over Syria in 2017. Because, well, those rumors may not be as crazy as they sound. Let's see what we can find out. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Earlier this week, Iran launched some 180 to 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, and immediately, media coverage and social media discourse was wild. If you follow me at all on social media, you likely saw me out there reminding people that ballistic missiles are not the same as hypersonic missiles, and that Twitter is not an effective place to do battle damage assessments from. And amid the flood of misinformation out there, ground news has been an invaluable tool for me to quickly identify outlets that are outliers in terms of their credibility. You see, ground news is an aggregator that collects news stories from outlets published all around the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed, making it easier than ever to compare coverage of the same story from different outlets. Ground news will tell you an outlet's ownership, its factuality rating, its political affiliations, and whether or not they're state-sponsored. Right here on ground news, I can see that 609 news outlets have covered this Iranian attack on Israel. And in terms of headlining, reports have been pretty consistent across the political spectrum. But with this many stories to sift through, it becomes really easy to identify the outlets that are not being very responsible with their headlining practices. Like this headline from the Gateway Pundit that reads, "Breaking, Iran has launched over 100 missiles at Israel. Missiles reportedly getting through Israel's Iron Dome." The Iron Dome, of course, is a short-range air defense system that would have nothing to do with defending against this attack. And while the average person may not know that, a news outlet certainly should. And then we have Russia's state-owned TASS, who claims it was actually 500 missiles launched at Israel. If you were to come across these headlines on their own, you might have little reason to question them. But because ground news makes it so easy to compare them to a breadth of headlines from other more reputable outlets, they really stand out. And when it comes to being well-informed, I also really like the Ground News Blind Spot feature, which shows you stories that are getting a great deal of traction in one political sphere and not in the other. Ground News is an invaluable part of my research and day-to-day news consumption, and if you want to get in on this, I can get you a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or follow that link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's to get 40% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. Now, I want to be clear right up front that this is probably going to be a 2-part video, because when I first started diving into this topic, I thought it might just be interesting to briefly summarize these rumors. But the deeper I dug, the more interesting this all became, and I just don't think I can give you the complete picture of why the F-117 really could have been brought back out of mothballs in just one 20 to 30 minute video. So in part 1, we'll go over the claims that a small cadre of F-117 Nighthawks were pulled out of storage and deployed to Syria as a part of Operation Inherent Resolve, either under the command of the US Air Force or potentially even the CIA. And then I'm going to delve a bit deeper into the F-117 itself as a platform, and why this more than 4-decade-old aircraft is not only still entirely viable for modern combat operations, but may have actually been the best suited asset in the American inventory for the unique operational environment the US found itself in Syria at that time. So with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. By now, just about everyone knows that America's F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft, has had a very busy retirement. Images and videos of Nighthawks taking to the sky might be even more common today than they were at the height of the jet's operational lifespan, with the Air Force's retired F-117s now playing the roles of adversary stealth fighters and even low observable cruise missiles for a wide variety of air combat exercises. It's a really logical use for the roughly 45 F-117s that are said to be held in what the Air Force calls Type 1000 flyable storage, which is an official term used to describe storing the aircraft, known to many just as black jets, in near flyable condition, just in case the US has a pressing need to get them back into the fight. Now, with a radar cross-section that's said to be as small as just 0.025 square meters, the Nighthawk is likely, as I said before, still more difficult to detect on radar than either China's Chengdu J-20 or Russia's Sukhoi Su-57 fifth-generation fighters, making the F-117 a perfectly suited test target for advancing counter-stealth technologies. But while the F-117's claim to fame may be introducing the world to stealth, it wasn't stealth alone that made the Nighthawk so special. Entering service only about a decade after America's last carpet bombing campaigns over Vietnam, the F-117's ability to deliver precision-guided ordnance to targets identified via an onboard laser designator with pinpoint accuracy was perhaps equally revolutionary at the time. Stealth made the Nighthawk nearly invisible to enemy detection, yes, but it was the laser-guided accuracy of the Black Jet's weapon systems that made it an unparalleled airborne sniper. And in fact, it may have been that very unique combination of stealth and the ability to deliver specifically laser-guided munitions that, according to rumor, saw a small number of Nighthawks brought out of retirement for a series of covert airstrikes in Syria as recently as 2017. Now, rumors of these classified operations have been around for a while, and they reached their zenith in March of 2019, when a respected Dutch aviation outlet called Scramble magazine went on record to claim these stories were actually true, with the F-117 pulled back into limited service specifically because of its ability to drop laser-guided munitions on moving targets, something no other stealth aircraft in the US inventory was capable of at that time. Now, Scramble did not reveal their sources, but did provide a few scant details into the alleged covert operations, and even an in-flight emergency suffered by one of the Nighthawks. According to Scramble's account, these covert operations were actually revealed when one of at least 4 deployed F-117s, believed to be operating out of Saudi Arabia or Qatar, suffered an in-flight emergency and was forced to land at the very remote Ali Al Salam airbase in Kuwait, roughly 30 miles from the Iraqi border. Scramble claimed to have spoken to multiple people who were on site at the time, seemingly military personnel, but not from the United States, who reported seeing the Nighthawk come in for a landing, accompanied by its wingman, another F-117 that did not land itself, but continued on, seemingly to its usual airbase. And according to the story, at least one of these witnesses was able to snap multiple photos using their iPhone. First, of both black jets, while the stricken one was coming in for a landing and its wingman was chasing behind, and then several more from long distance of the landed F-117 parked on the apron of the runway. Now, I know what you're thinking. If we've got these photographs, then this isn't a rumor, it's a confirmed report of Nighthawks operating in the Middle East. But there's a problem. While Scramble says they were able to review these photographs at length, they were not given permission to publish them, both for security reasons and because revealing the photographs could potentially reveal the source. For Scramble's part, they claimed that they were able to verify the authenticity of the photos by matching visible facility infrastructure shown alongside the F-117 with known facility infrastructure at the Ali El Salam airbase. But because we can't review these photographs for ourselves, this is really just another interesting but unconfirmed element of this story. In fact, I think it's important for you to know that throughout my research, I have been able to uncover no hard evidence whatsoever in the public domain that points to this story being true. But that doesn't mean that it isn't. And in fact, not only was the F-117 Nighthawk's combination of stealth and laser-guided ordnance particularly well suited for the sorts of combat operations the US was involved in over Syria at the time, but the Nighthawk may have actually been the only aircraft in the US inventory in 2017 capable of doing the job within acceptable margins for risk. But in order to really appreciate why the F-117 may not have just been a good choice, but arguably the only choice for these airstrike operations, even in this era of B-2 Spirits, F-22 Raptors, and F-35 Lightning IIs, we need to take a stroll down memory lane. You see, throughout aviation history, there are a handful of platforms that stand out as pivot points in the way we go about designing and employing aircraft in the modern era. The Wright Flyer introduced the world to powered flight. The Messerschmitt Me-262 propelled aviation into the jet age. The General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcons fly-by-wire controls helped turn air-to-air combat into a quantifiable science. But few, if any, aircraft in history represent as dramatic a shift in the direction and the employment of aviation technology as Lockheed's legendary F-117. In a time when the most advanced tactical aircraft in the world would light up adversary radar screens like a Greyhound bus, Ben Rich, the director of Lockheed Skunk Works and the head of the F-117 program, famously walked into the offices of senior Pentagon officials and rolled a single marble across their desks. "Here's the observability of your airplane on radar," Rich famously said of their black jet design, and the concept, while admittedly outlandish at the time, was so promising that Rich received a contract to begin engineering work on the Nighthawk in November of 1977. A full month before Lockheed's stealth technology demonstrator, called Have Blue, would even prove the concept could fly. Just 6 years later, on October 28, 1983, Rich's Skunk Works secretly delivered the 14th production F-117 Nighthawk to the Air Force's clandestine 4450th Tactical Group out of the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada. With more than a dozen operational aircraft now on hand, the delivery also marked the Black Jet's entrance into initial operating capability, or operational service. In a chorus of hushed tones and redacted documents, Ben Rich, Lockheed's Skunk Works, and the U.S. Air Force had changed the focus and direction of military aerospace technology for decades, maybe even a century or more to come. And only a handful of people in the world even knew about it. The 4450th was established just a few years prior for the sole purpose of turning America's newest piece of aviation technology into an operational weapons platform. Though, as far as the public and even many of the personnel assigned to the unit were told, they'd be doing little more than testing avionics for the A-7D Corsair II. But on November 10, 1988, Uncle Sam let the cat out of the bag, acknowledging the existence and the designation of the F-117 Nighthawk, even if the public wouldn't get its first good look at the aircraft for another 2 years to come. In fact, the Nighthawk would see combat before ever seeing a crowd. On December 19, 1989, Nighthawks departed Tonopah and were joined by tanker aircraft that accompanied them through 7 in-flight refuelings over 8 hours, as the stealth jets covered more than 3,000 miles to their targets in Panama, as part of Operation Just Cause. Flight leader Greg Feast would later recall dropping a 2,000-pound laser-guided GPU-27 bomb on an open field close to Panamanian military barracks, with the intent of disorienting defensive forces. Within minutes of the bomb making landfall, American Special Operations troops were parachuting down into its crater to begin their hunt for General Manuel Noriega. It was the start of an historically successful combat career. 2 years later, in the early morning hours of January 17, 1991, the job of leading a formation of 10 F-117s into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, Baghdad, Iraq, would once again fall to Major Greg Feast. Just before 3 a.m. local time, Feast peered through the infrared image on his multifunction display, or MFD, in the cockpit, and carefully compared it to intelligence photographs he kept on a board strapped to his leg. Once he was sure he'd found his target, Feast used the fingertip target designator to bring the aircraft's crosshairs over the center of the bunker. When he released the target designator button, it automatically fired up an invisible laser that burst out from behind a radar-absorbent screen on the underside of the Nighthawk's nose, illuminating the path for his 2,000-pound bomb to follow to the target he identified. As Feast would later recount, Iraqi forces didn't fire a single shot in his direction until the bomb hit. And then they were firing frantically in every direction. They had no idea where he or his black jet were. The Nighthawk's unique and invaluable laser targeting capabilities were put on full display for the public just 3 days later in a press conference held by Coalition Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf. The general pulled up the downward-looking infrared camera footage from an F-117 tasked with striking a hardened storage facility housing Scud ballistic missiles. The pilot, whose name was not disclosed, placed his target designator in the center of a 1-meter-wide air vent on the facility's roof. And with just the push of a red button on the top of the stick, the pilot was able to thread the needle perfectly, lobbing the 2,000-pound bomb straight through that open vent, obliterating the entire facility in one fell swoop. Throughout the Desert Storm air campaign, Nighthawks flew just 2% of the total coalition combat sorties, but reportedly accounted for nearly 40% of all strategic targets hit. 2 months after the air campaign concluded, the U.S. Air Force released a white paper assessing the performance of tactical aircraft throughout the conflict, and it was already clear that the F-117 represented a significant leap forward in air power technology. I'll quote that report here. During the war, it flew almost 1,300 combat sorties, dropped over 2,000 tons of bombs, flew over 6,900 hours, and demonstrated accuracy unmatched in the history of warfare. And while the Nighthawk's stealth was the game-changing technology that made the platform so successful, the Air Force also recognized that it wasn't stealth alone that had made such a significant impact. I'll quote that report again. The value of the F-117 was that it combined stealth technology and precision delivery. As the report went on to explain, it was stealth that made the Nighthawk the only aircraft capable of going after targets in heavily defended Baghdad airspace. But, quote, precision delivery assured the F-117 could destroy those targets in a single mission, with great lethality. The F-117 would continue to serve until 2008, long enough to see its groundbreaking approach to stealth manifest in the first flights of Northrop's B-2 Spirit and Lockheed Martin's own F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II. These new stealth jets could carry greater payloads, defeat more advanced forms of detection and targeting, outfly the best adversary fighters on the planet, and a whole lot more. As compared to the attack-specific Nighthawk, with its subsonic top speed, limited payload capacity, and sluggish maneuverability, stealth fighters like the F-22 represented a generational leap forward in capability. But the F-117 was still among the stealthiest aircraft on the planet, even as it flew off into the sunset. And notably, its laser targeting capabilities were just as potent as ever. So now let's skip ahead 9 years to 2017 in Syria and talk about why the F-117 may have been needed there. That year found the United States operating in an incredibly complex combat environment in Syria, balancing its counter-ISIS operations in support of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, against increasing tensions with Russian forces in the same region fighting the same adversary, but in support of Syria's sitting government, the totalitarian regime of Bashar al-Assad. After civil war broke out in Syria in 2012, an element of former al-Qaeda members known as the Nusra Front merged with the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI, to found what would come to be known as ISIS, or the Islamic State, in 2013. And by 2017, that terror organization was in control of roughly a third of the nation. And while the SDF and Assad's regime were still at war with one another, both parties recognized the threat posed by ISIS as the most pressing. With the United States and literally dozens of other nations supporting the SDF and Russia supporting Assad, both sides went about taking their fight to ISIS directly. With tensions high, the US and Russia initially adhered to a Memorandum of Understanding and Air Safety in Syria that was signed in October of 2015, which called for general professionalism in Syrian airspace among all countries' aviators and established a deconfliction channel in which Russia and the US could engage in resolving burgeoning conflicts. By 2017, that deconfliction channel had evolved into a 24-hour hotline, and while the Russian government repeatedly threatened to suspend these communications, the line remained intact. But despite these efforts to quell any possibility of open hostilities between Russian and American elements operating in Syria, the reality of the conflict repeatedly proved that the agreement was rather one-sided. Syria's continued use of chemical weapons and nerve agents against the civilian population, often enabled or at least obfuscated by Russian support, worsened matters even further. And after one such nerve agent attack killed a reported 80 civilians in early April 2017, President Donald Trump ordered a kinetic strike against Syria's Al-Sharat airbase. A total of 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from destroyers USS Porter and USS Ross from the eastern Mediterranean Sea, wiping out Syrian air defenses, hardened aircraft structures, ammunition storage facilities, and more. But even still, US-backed SDF forces and Russian-backed Syrian forces continued their offensives against ISIS, using the Euphrates River as the de facto border between them, with the SDF primarily occupying the northeast portion of Syria and Assad responsible for the territory west of the Euphrates. But tensions would only keep escalating from there. On June 18, 2017, Syrian forces attacked an SDF-held town just south of Tabqa, near the Euphrates. As American officials attempted to reach Russian leaders via the deconfliction hotline, a Syrian Air Force Su-22 moved to engage the American-backed forces in the area. As a result, a U.S. Navy F-A-18 Super Hornet piloted by Lieutenant Commander Michael Mob Tremmel engaged and shot it down using an AIM-120 AMRAAM, radar-guided air-to-air missile. A similar incident played out in September 2017, with Russian aircraft bombing a position where SDF troops and American advisors were known to be located. Following that second incident, senior leaders from both countries met once again in an effort to deconflict the counter-terror operations. And in November, American and Russian officials formally agreed to keep Russian-backed Syrian forces on the west side of the river and American-backed SDF forces on the east. But it immediately became clear that Russia had offered only hollow promises. U.S. coalition forces continued to report both Russian and Syrian military aircraft crossing the Euphrates River 6 to 8 times per day. In fact, an estimated 10% of all Russian flight activity violated the agreement to respect that boundary. On November 15th, 2 U.S. Air Force A-10s flying east of the Euphrates nearly collided with a Russian Su-24 as it performed aggressive maneuvers, seemingly trying to bait them into a fight, 2 days later, a Russian Su-30 crossed the line and flew directly under another pair of A-10s in another attempt at intimidation. Now, that same day, 2 American F-22 Raptors intercepted a Russian Su-24 operating on the wrong side of the Euphrates. They shadowed the ground attack aircraft for 20 minutes as it made mock bombing passes over SDF forces on the ground, again, seemingly trying to provoke the air superiority fighters into firing. American officials even came forward and stated that the Raptor pilots would have been within their legal rights to fire, but demonstrated great restraint and professionalism in preventing yet another escalation. I'm going to quote command spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Damian Pickert, who was explaining that their primary concerns wasn't the Russian aggression, but rather what might happen if they're forced to shoot these Russian aircraft down. Quote, "It's become increasingly tough for our pilots to discern whether Russian pilots are deliberately testing or baiting us into reacting, or if these are just honest mistakes. The greatest concern is that we could shoot down a Russian aircraft because its actions are seen as a threat to our air or ground forces." Not only were tensions at a literal boil between American and Russian aircraft over Syria, but Russia had also been bolstering Syria's air defense capabilities throughout their controlled territory. Very clearly, not in an effort to counter ISIS. Russia had already deployed an S-400 battery to Syria in 2015, another S-300 VM battery in 2016, and several less advanced systems like the SA-22 all throughout the nation. For American forces focused on routing ISIS, this created a unique problem that maybe only the Nighthawk could solve. You see, if US-backed forces found themselves engaging ISIS militants who fled across that deconfliction line into Russian-controlled territory, they could immediately find themselves at risk of being engaged by Russian or Syrian aircraft and air defenses. For a stealth fighter like the F-22 Raptor, that wasn't really much of a concern, as its stealth would allow it to operate all but freely, even in the most heavily guarded airspace. But unlike the Nighthawk, the Raptor lacked a laser designator and instead could only use GPS-guided weapons like the 1,000-pound GBU-32 for air-to-ground operations. Now, GPS-guided weapons can be much more effective in adverse weather conditions or when visibility is limited, but until recently, with the incorporation of alternate seekers, GPS-guided bombs were not capable of hitting a moving target. So despite its ability to operate with near impunity inside Russian-controlled Syrian airspace, the F-22 could do little to engage a fleeing ISIS commander, for instance. While the Navy's F-35s were not in service yet at the time, both the Marine Corps and Air Force did have operational F-35s by 2017, but they faced a similar problem. While the F-35's AN/AAQ-40 electrical-optical targeting system does include a laser designator, these aircraft lacked the requisite software they'd need to use it effectively against moving targets until Block 3F, which wouldn't make its way into service until 2019. Conversely, slow and non-stealth drones like the MQ-9 Reaper were flying with all the hardware they would need to engage moving targets like a fleeing ISIS commander, but with a cruising speed of around 230 miles per hour and a prominent radar return, the MQ-9 would be easy prey for any aggressive Russian or Syrian air defender or pilot. If the United States wanted to be able to engage moving targets west of the Euphrates in order to rout ISIS from the region, there wasn't a single in-service aircraft with the capability to do it without putting them at risk of being directly engaged by Russian defenses. But there was one platform, tucked away inside the climate-controlled hangars of Tonopah, that had everything it needed to operate inside contested airspace and take out terrorists on the run. An aircraft with the stealth necessary to operate even amid Russian air defenses, and the laser designator necessary to hit a moving target. And you guessed it was the F-117 Nighthawk. And that is where we'll leave it for this week. In our next episode, we'll delve deeper into the operations these F-117s allegedly flew and other benefits these aircraft could have offered over the stealth platforms in service at the time. We'll discuss whether or not there's any historical precedent for operations of this sort and see if we can't figure out once and for all whether or not we think this story is true or just a fun piece of aviation folklore. Now, I'm going to be on the road next week in Colorado, visiting NORAD, or the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORTHCOM, or U.S. Northern Command, and SPACECOM, or Space Command. So let me know in the comments down below if you've got any questions you'd like me to dig into while I'm there. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.